Greetings, hush-born listener. Do you hear the whisper of wood smoke curling through the rafters? Let it drift around you like the breath of old pine as twilight softens the edges of the longhouse walls. The fire has burned low, and the wind outside has stilled. This is the hour when silence settles into the bones of the earth, and stories begin to breathe. In the year 793, the sea mists hung heavy over the northern coast of Lindisfarne, cloaking the stones in a quiet shroud. Farther north still, across the frayed edges of the sea, in a narrow inlet carved by ice and memory, a village of low-roofed houses clung to the base of the cliffs. The people there were not yet known to the world as Vikings, but the rhythm of axe and anvil, of salt and soil, had long shaped their days. Among them was a boy named Eric. He was not the strongest of the children, nor the boldest, but he had a curious mind and eyes that always sought patterns, in clouds, in waves, in the scatter of bones left behind after a feast. His father, a blacksmith of fair renown, said the boy had too much wind and not enough fire in him. His mother, who brewed birch ale and knew the names of every plant that grew wild on the slopes, only smiled. She saw other fires in her son, fires that did not burn with heat, but with thought. On the day he turned 12, Eric followed an old man into the forest. This was not unusual, for the old man was Halvar, a carver of stones and keeper of runes. Some called him a skald. Others said he had no tongue for poems, only for lines and secrets. Halvar spoke little, but his hands never ceased their patient movement. He etched letters into antler and wood and stone, always alone, always with great care. Have you ever wondered what it felt like to sit beside someone who knew things you could not name, and to sense, in your bones, that some knowledge could only be learned through stillness? Eric brought Halvar a bundle of juniper. The old man said nothing, only nodded once and handed the boy a worn blade with a dull bronze hilt. Then he placed before him a small disk of driftwood, smooth and pale as milk. That was the first day Eric touched a rune with his own hand. The symbol was Fehu, the wealth rune, shaped like a tilted F with horns that reached up and outward. Halvar said the rune did not merely mean wealth. It was a sound, a force, a breath caught in wood. It was not to be written lightly. Eric didn't understand then. He only knew the feeling of the blade in his hand, the grain of the wood resisting him, the shiver of excitement at being trusted with something quiet and old. The days grew shorter. The sea began to carry the smell of snow. Halvar spoke more as winter crept in, though always in riddles. Some runes, he said one night as they shared a slab of salted fish, sing only when carved in bone. Others prefer stone, and one should never be carved at all, for it does not shape meaning, it unmakes it. Eirik asked which rune that was. Halvar did not answer. He only looked to the fire and traced a circle in the ashes. Years passed like the tide, coming and going without warning. Eirik grew taller, his hands surer. He learned not just the shapes of the runes, but their ways. He learned that Rido could be drawn before a journey to guide the traveler, but only if the path was honest. That Algiz, the protection rune, should be carved on the door lintel during the waning moon. That per throw, mysterious, like a cup turned down, could bring luck or loss, depending on who watched you draw it. Each rune had a spirit. Each stroke carried weight. Halvar taught him this, not with lectures, but with long silences and small tasks. Once, he made Eric trace the same rune, Ansus, into soft clay 100 times by lamplight, until the shape no longer felt like a letter, but like breathing. One spring morning, Halvar did not come to the clearing. Eric waited until the sun touched the trees, and then he followed the narrow deer paths to Halvar's house, a crooked hut pressed against the rocks. The door was open. Inside, the fire had long since gone out. Halvar lay still on his bed of moss and straw, eyes closed, mouth curved slightly, as if amused by a final private thought. On the small table beside him was a bundle wrapped in wool. Eric opened it with shaking fingers. Inside was a blade, finer than any he had used before, and a rune stone the size of a hand. On it was carved a single unfamiliar mark. It looked like a broken circle with a thorn running through its center. It made his breath catch in his throat. He touched it and felt, for the first time, not knowledge, but a silence so deep it pushed against the world. The air shifted around him, though no wind stirred. The birds outside fell quiet. Even the ocean, distant though it was, seemed to hush. He wrapped the stone again and did not speak of it to anyone. Not when the villagers asked about Halvar. Not when he buried the man beneath the standing birch, marked only with Iwaz, the yew tree, for death and transition. Eric became the carver after that. People brought him wood and bone and stone, and he etched what they asked. For healing, for good weather, for strength in childbirth. He used only the safe runes, the old runes. But the wrapped stone never left his side. Some nights, when the snow piled high against the door and the fire hissed low, he would unwrap it and stare. The rune did not change, but he began to dream of it. In one dream, it bled. In another, it whispered his name, not aloud, but behind his eyes. Still, he did not speak it. Have you ever held something you did not understand, but could not bear to throw away? The seasons moved forward, as they always do. And one day, a stranger came to the village. He was tall and pale, with hair like unwashed linen and eyes that did not seem to look at anyone, but at the space behind them. He wore no iron, no fur, no brooch, only a cloak of woven grass and a pouch made from stitched leaves. He came not in a boat, but on foot, from the sea. And when he saw Eric's hands, he smiled. The hush of soft footsteps on wet moss brings tonight's greeting, dear listener. Imagine the sound of dew, gathering on old stones, unnoticed and patient, until the earth forgets it was ever dry. That is the rhythm we drift into now, not with clamor or demand, but with the silent insistence of things meant to be remembered. The stranger stood at the edge of the village, where the rock met the sand, and the wind curled like a question around the eaves of the longhouses. His arrival caused no alarm. The dogs did not bark. The gulls circled once and vanished. Only the children noticed, and even they did not approach, but instead watched him with wide eyes from behind barrels of fish and low stone fences. Eirik was preparing a piece of ashwood for a wedding talisman when he heard the silence behind him deepen. He turned, knife still in hand, and saw the man standing just beyond the fence, not close enough to speak, yet not distant enough to ignore. He was not wet, though the sea had been thick with mist that morning. His feet were bare, but not bruised or cut. Around his throat hung a charm that did not shine or clink. It was made of bark, curled inward like a listening ear, threaded with what looked like flax. The man did not speak. Instead, he lifted one hand and opened his fingers. In the center of his palm lay a small disk of stone. It was carved, and Eric's breath caught, for it bore the same mark, the one Halvar had left him. The broken circle, the thorn, the silent weight of something unspoken. He did not take the stone. He only nodded once and gestured for the man to follow him. They walked in silence, past the blacksmith's forge, where the iron hissed and steamed, past the well, where old women gossiped between lowering buckets, past the drying racks of cod, stiff in the late spring air. No one stopped them. But later, many would say they felt something pass through the village that day. A breeze without source, a shadow without weight. Eric brought the man to Halvar's hut. It had stood empty for nearly a year, though Eric had returned to it often, drawn by habit more than purpose. There was always a faint scent of juniper there, though none grew nearby. He offered the man a place to sit and lit a small lamp with trembling fingers. The man watched him, but his gaze was gentle, unhurried. There was no hunger in his eyes, no urgency, only waiting. After some time, he spoke. His voice was low, clear, and carried the stillness of stones under snow. "You have the other piece." Eric did not deny it. He reached beneath the floorboards and unwrapped the woolen bundle. The rune stone lay within, unchanged. He set it beside the stranger's. They were nearly identical, nearly. The stranger turned his piece over. On the back was etched another rune. One Eric recognized longhouses, the water rune. It shimmered faintly, though the light was dim. The stranger said, "Only one of us can carry both." Eric asked what it meant, what the rune was, but the man shook his head slowly. "You already know," he said. "You've known since you dreamed it." Eric wanted to argue, to ask for reason, for history, for explanation, but the words would not come. Instead, he said, "What happens if I carve it?" The man looked at the fire, now just a low orange thread. "It speaks." To who? To what listens? The silence between them stretched like the sky before a storm. Eric felt the weight of years pressing down upon him, not just his own, but Halvar's, and the unknown ages before. Have you ever stood on the edge of a thing and known that stepping forward would change not just your path, but the shape of silence itself? The man left before dawn. He took nothing and left nothing behind, save for his half of the stone, which he placed carefully beside the other. The two pieces did not fit together, but they hummed faintly when near one another, like bees inside a wall. Eric did not sleep that night. When the morning came, he could not remember if he had ever truly slept since Halvar's death. He began carving again, not the forbidden rune, but those he knew, the safe ones, for protection, for childbirth, for the boats going out to sea. But his hands were less sure. The lines felt dull, the strokes heavy. Even Ansus, once like breath to him, now tasted bitter. He found himself walking to Halvar's grave more often. It was overgrown now, the yew tree's roots beginning to swell. He did not speak aloud, but in his mind he asked, "What did you see? Why did you carve it? Why leave it to me?" There was no answer, but he began to feel watched, not by people, not even by the gods, for theirs was a distant gaze, scattered across the sagas and blood and songs. This was a different watching, closer, patient. It came in the moment before sleep, in the place where thought and breath become mist. He saw flashes of dark water, of hands without bodies, moving across the surface of stone, of voices that never rose above a whisper, yet echoed as if sung through chambers of bone. He did not speak of this to the villagers. He carved what they asked. He smiled when they thanked him, but he no longer traced runes into the earth when he was alone. He feared they would answer. The seasons turned. The yew tree grew taller. And one day, while carving a blessing rune into a cradle, Eric felt his hand twitch, not violently, but just enough. Enough to change the shape of the rune. Enough to turn Berkana, the birch tree, birth and healing, into something else. Something almost like the broken circle. He stopped, heart hammering, though the day was cool. The child was not yet born. He burned the cradle and made another, blaming the wood grain. No one questioned him. But that night, he buried the ash far from the village and did not sleep. He tried to leave once, packed his tools, wrapped both stones, and set off southward toward the high passes and the trade roads. But at the river crossing, the bridge was gone, swept away by a storm that had not yet come. When he turned back, the clouds parted. It was then he realized it would not let him go. The rune, or what lay beneath it. So he changed. He carved less, spoke less, wandered more. He began collecting stones from the riverbeds, not to carve, but to listen. Some, he swore, vibrated faintly when placed beside the rune stones. Others cracked without reason. He buried many of them. He began to speak to the stones, not expecting answers. But one night, he received one. A dream, more vivid than any before. He was standing in Halvar's hut, though the roof was gone and the stars shone down through the beams. The table before him was covered in rune stones, all bearing the broken mark. They glowed faintly, pulsed in rhythm, as if breathing. Then he looked up and saw the stranger from the sea, but his eyes were no longer pale. They were runes themselves, shifting and reforming, never resting. "You have heard it now," the stranger said. Eric woke with a taste of salt on his tongue, and that morning he knew he would have to carve it, not for power, not for knowledge, but because it had already been written, not by him, but through him. In his breath, his dreams, his silence. He would not do it in wood or bone. It had to be stone, old stone, stone that remembered. He returned to the cliffs where he had first watched Halvar work. The path was steep. The gulls wheeled above. The sea below sang softly, not menacing, not welcoming, only eternal. He knelt on a flat slab of granite, the two stones before him. The sky was thick with cloud, but no rain came. And slowly, he took the blade Halvar had left him. Its edge had not dulled. It shimmered, just slightly, as if remembering too. He pressed it to the stone, and began. "Welcome again, wandering soul. Tonight the wind carries the scent of damp lichen and distant pine, like the breath of a forest after rain. Let your thoughts sway with that quiet green hush, like moss swaying in the shadows of old trees. All around you, the world softens. The stones still remember. And we return now, gently, to the edge of the cliff, where Eric carves in silence. The granite slab beneath his knees was older than memory. Long before the first roof was raised in his village, long before men whispered the names of gods into the frost, this stone had slept. Its surface was weathered, but unbroken, a skin of time. Eric had chosen it because it did not belong to anyone, not even to the land. It stood between cliff and sea, half forgotten by the goats that grazed above and the birds that circled below. It was not a sacred place, but it was a place where silence gathered easily. His fingers moved slowly. The blade did not bite deeply, but traced, almost, with reverence. The rune he carved was the one that had haunted him, not in form alone, but in silence. It was not in any of the old staves, not taught, not spoken, a broken circle, as if a bond had once been whole and had been severed. Through it a single vertical thorn, or perhaps a tree, or perhaps a wound. It did not tell its name. He did not speak it aloud as he worked. To name something, Halvar had once told him, was to risk owning it, and some things cannot be owned without consequence. The first stroke rang faintly in his ears, though no sound came from the blade. The second felt heavier, like wind pressing against the back of his neck. And by the third, the sky had shifted, not in color, but in mood. It no longer watched with indifference. Have you ever known, with sudden certainty, that you are being watched by something that does not need eyes? When the rune was complete, Eirik did not rise. He sat with it as dusk slid in like a tide, slow and unspoken. The stone beneath him remained still. Nothing cracked, nothing flared or screamed. But something had changed. The gulls had gone silent. The wind, which had always whispered among the reeds and hollows, now hung motionless, and his thoughts, usually crowded and anxious, were swept clean. Not empty, but vast, like the surface of a lake before the first ripple. He placed both stones beside the carving, the one from Halvar and the one from the stranger, and sat until the stars crept out one by one. It was then he noticed something strange. The stars above him did not match the sky he had known all his life. The patterns had shifted, subtle, slight, but unmistakable to someone who had grown beneath them. He stood slowly and gathered the stones. As he turned to descend the cliff, he paused. Where once there had been a faint trail worn into the earth by his own feet and Halvar's long ago, now there was only moss, deep, unbroken, as if no one had ever walked here at all. The world had not changed, but the story beneath it had. The return to the village was longer than he remembered. The forest pressed in more closely. The trees, though unchanged in shape, held themselves differently, not threatening, but watching, as if curious. The owls did not call. Even the stream near the Elders' Hall ran quieter, like a breath drawn in and not yet released. When he reached the threshold of his home, he saw it had been swept, and the candle he always left unlit during his absence was now flickering low, not freshly lit, not ancient, just as if it had never gone out. Inside, the air was warm. A bowl of broth sat on the table, still steaming, but he had told no one he was leaving, had left no sign. He stepped inside, slowly. There, seated in the corner beside the hearth, was a woman. She was not young, nor old. Her cloak was woven of gray wool, edged with patterns not found in any loom of the northern coast. Her hair was bound in a simple braid, held not by bronze or shell, but by a carved bead of dark, polished stone. And upon it, faint and almost invisible, the same broken rune. Eirik did not speak. Neither did she. She gestured toward the broth. He sat. He ate. The taste was familiar. Thyme, a hint of goat, and something older. A bitterness, like crushed acorns soaked too long. It grounded him. Only then did she speak, and her voice was softer than Halvar's, but it carried the same weight, the kind that settled behind your ribs and stayed there. You have opened a door that does not close. He nodded. You will not leave this village again, she said, not as command, but as observation. He nodded again. Her eyes, gray-green like river ice, studied him not with judgment, but with recognition. You saw the stars. He did not ask how she knew. Instead, he whispered, Why do they move? She smiled, faint and sad. Because the thread has been touched. What thread? Her gaze flicked to the stones in his hands, the thread that holds meaning to silence, that separates what is spoken from what is kept beneath. He wanted to ask more. What had he done? What had Halvar left for him? What was the purpose of the stranger? Why had the rune chosen him? But he asked nothing, because suddenly he understood the most terrifying thing. There were no answers, not the kind that sat cleanly in a mouth, only stories. And the story had already begun? The woman rose. Her movements were soundless, but they carried weight. Not the weight of flesh, but of memory. She walked to the door and paused. When the lake fog returns, you must go to the standing stones. He wanted to ask why, but she was already gone. And outside, the owls had begun to sing again. Days passed, or perhaps it was weeks. The villagers did not seem to notice his absence from their festivals or his long hours spent in silence. They came for carving still, but no longer asked for protection or wealth. They asked for memory, for the names of ancestors to be etched on smooth river rocks, for old stories to be carved into staves of alder. And one day, a woman brought her daughter, who had not spoken since birth, and asked for a rune that would open the tongue. Eric paused. He traced Ansu's for speech and breath. But the girl shook her head. Then, without looking, she picked up a scrap of bark and drew the broken circle. And Eric, for the first time, spoke its name. He did not know he knew it until it left his mouth. Skada. A soft word, like wind through dead leaves, like something scraping gently at the back of the mind. The girl blinked, and then whispered, "Yes." The mother wept, but not in joy, not in fear, in awe. Have you ever felt a word settle into the world, not like a sound, but like a returning? That night, Eric sat beside the carved stone on the cliff and traced the rune with his fingers, not to summon, not to command, but to remember. He whispered its name again, and this time, the stone answered. Not in sound, but in image. He saw, just briefly, an endless hall of ice, and within it, rows upon rows of figures, all silent, all watching. In their hands, each held a small stone. All bore the same mark. He did not know what they waited for, but he knew they had not spoken in centuries. And yet, now, they stirred, and the stars shifted once more. Tonight, gentle dreamer, I greet you with the hush of fog weaving low through valley grass. It moves slowly, as though remembering every blade, every footprint, every story that fell asleep beneath the moss. Let it fold around your breath now, cool, soft, forgotten. The world does not need to speak. It only needs to listen. Eric awoke before the sun. Though no rooster called, the village was still wrapped in pre-dawn quiet, yet the air bore a different weight. Not heavy, but saturated, like cloth soaked in memory. He opened his door and saw it at once. The fog had come. It curled along the paths like wool from an unspooled spindle, thick but not choking, damp but not cold. It gathered in hollows, wrapped fences, crept up stones. There was no sound, no birdsong. Even the goats stayed within their pens, blinking slow, unbothered. He did not rush. He gathered the 2 rune stones, wrapped them in the wool Halvar had left. Around his wrist, he tied a thin strip of leather and etched Lagus into its center, not for protection, but to remind himself to move like water, to receive, to remember. He left the longhouse without food. Hunger would not follow him today. The standing stones lay half a day's walk east, beyond the low marshes and the shallow creek where his mother once gathered reeds for basket work. Eric had passed them many times as a boy, but never stopped long. They were old, irregular, too worn by wind and lichen to bear the clear markings of any clan. No tales were told of them by the hearth. They were not forbidden. They were simply left alone. But this morning, the path to them was lined with stillness, the kind that does not wait but accompanies. As he walked, the mist thickened, but never blinded. It swirled around his ankles, waist, shoulders, as if measuring him or shielding him. There were no insects, no snapping twigs, only the faint rhythm of his own breath and the steady beat of his steps against moss and stone. He did not think of the village, or the girl who had spoken, or even Halvar's absence. All thought had thinned out, replaced by something quieter than thought: awareness. The standing stones revealed themselves not all at once, but gradually, as if emerging from sleep. First, a single upright slab, half leaning, dark with moisture. Then another, squatter, like a kneeling figure. Then more, a rough circle, not perfect, but intentional. 12 in all. He entered the space between them without hesitation. Here, the air felt older than elsewhere. Not colder, but as if shaped by many breaths before his. He could not hear his own footsteps now. The fog inside, the circle, was thinner, like it respected the shape of the stones. He sat at the center, knees folded beneath him. He placed the 2 rune stones before him, and beside them, a fresh slate of river rock he had taken from the creek before dawn. Smooth, oval, damp. He breathed, once, twice, then began to trace. Not the forbidden rune, not yet, but the ones that had brought him here. Ansus for breath, Lagus for flow, Perthro for what is hidden and what chooses to be revealed. Then, with the edge of Halvar's blade, he carved Skada. The sound of the world did not change, but the center of the circle grew still, utterly still, as if time itself had paused at the edge of stone. And then he saw them. Figures, barely visible through the fog beyond the circle's edge. Not moving, not approaching, but present. They stood among the stones, as if they had always been there. Tall, robed in wool, or skin, or bark. None bore weapons. None wore faces he recognized. And yet, he felt no fear. One stepped forward, a woman with a spindle tied to her belt and hands the color of river clay. She did not speak aloud. Her voice unfolded inside his chest. You have carved what should not be shaped. Eirik bowed his head, not in shame, but in understanding. It asked to be remembered, he replied, not aloud, but from within. Another figure emerged, a man whose eyes held stars, not from this sky. He carried no tool, no token, only silence. You have remembered too well, the man said. Eric's fingers closed around the 2 rune stones. They pulsed faintly with warmth. I do not know what it means, he admitted. You were not meant to, said a third voice, older than the others, like wind through hollow trees, but it chose you. He looked at them, this gathering of shapes and stories, and whispered, Why? A pause, then softly, because the silence is fraying. Behind them, in the fog, something shifted, not closer, but deeper, as if another layer of the world had turned, revealing a seam. Have you ever wondered, the river clay woman asked, why some things are forgotten even by the gods? Eric felt the answer before he could speak it, because some memories are not stories, but warnings. He looked down at the stone in his lap. The rune pulsed faintly now, not with light, but with memory, as if it remembered all who had ever carved it. Halvar, the stranger, himself, and others, so many others. He could feel them, not their names, but their shape. People who had touched this thread, who had carved not for power or prophecy, but because they had to. Because the rune does not teach, it waits. It waits to be found by those who hear silence not as absence, but as language. A fourth figure, small, bowed, eyes clouded like smoke, stepped into the circle. In his hands, he held a bowl of dark liquid. He set it before Eric. The message was clear. Drink. Eric took the bowl. The liquid was thick, bitter, not unfamiliar. It tasted of crushed yew, smoked alder, and something like iron. It pulled heat from his throat and placed a cool weight behind his eyes. And then the stones around him pulsed, not with light, but with memory. And the world broke open. He was not sitting now. He was kneeling beside Halvar, a boy again, the old man tracing the broken rune in frost on a log. He was a child, hearing his mother whisper stories of women who wove words beneath their tongues, never speaking them aloud. He was the stranger, stepping from sea to shore with no footsteps left behind. He was the girl, drawing the rune without ever being taught. He was the silence itself, waiting to be carved. And in the center of it all was the rune. Not Skada alone, but all runes, folded in, unwritten, watching. A thread connecting every forgotten name. He gasped, and the vision faded. The figures were gone. The fog thinned. The stones stood quietly around him, as they always had, empty of voice. But in the center of the circle, on the stone he had carved, the rune remained. And beneath it, without his hand having moved, another line had been scratched into the stone. Not a rune, a question. What do you serve? He stared at it for a long time, then gathered the stones, the blade, and rose. He did not answer aloud, but as he walked away, the fog closed behind him, not to obscure, but to keep the question safe. Let this evening's welcome arrive as the creak of a floorboard beneath your bare feet. Not sudden, not startling, but deep and familiar. Imagine the scent of hearth ash and worn wool, the softness of old wood underhand, the way a quiet home holds the memory of every step you've ever taken. Let that warmth draw you in as we return now, without hurry, to the path Eric walks, where stories breathe under stones. The village had not changed. The roofs still smoked with morning cook fires. The children still darted through alleyways with smudged cheeks and laughter like bird call. The old men still sat near the salt racks, complaining of knees and weather, and the sea still lapped with its usual indifference at the rocky edge of the inlet. And yet, for Eric, everything had shifted. He walked among them quietly, his satchel slung across his shoulder, the carved stone nestled deep inside. He did not speak of the fog, or the 12 stones, or the bowl he drank from, or the faces that spoke without mouths. He nodded when spoken to. He carved when asked. He smiled when expected. But the rune hummed beneath his skin like a second heartbeat. It did not speak in words, but its presence settled into the corners of his vision, the tilt of shadows at dusk, the pause before birds took flight, the dreams that no longer belonged entirely to him. He was not alone in this noticing. The girl who had once been silent began visiting his hut with a regularity that seemed guided by something beyond choice. Her name was Svala, he learned, meaning swallow, and like her, named Sake. She flitted between words now with a quiet grace. She never asked for stories, but she often listened as if someone else were telling one only she could hear. One evening, as he carved Jera into a strip of birch for a couple hoping to bless their coming harvest, Svala placed a bundle of dried moss beside his hearth and asked, "Do you know what it's doing?" Eric looked up, puzzled. She tapped her chest gently over her heart. The stone. It's weaving something. I feel it like threads pulling at dreams. He didn't ask how she knew. Instead, he sat beside her and said softly, "There was a question in the stone after I carved it." "What do you serve?" she said, without needing to be told. He turned toward her then. "What do you think it means?" She tilted her head, thoughtful. "It's not asking who you serve, not a name. It's asking, what?" A thread, a current, a silence. Eric stared into the fire. It had burned low, casting a circle of dim orange around the room. He thought of Halvar, of the bowl in the fog, of the figures that stood without speaking. "I think I serve memory," he said finally, "but not just of people, of something deeper." Svala nodded. "Not memory, as in remembering. Memory as in anchoring." He looked at her again. "Have you always known?" "No," she said, "but I've always listened." In the days that followed, the dreams deepened. Eric began to see not only symbols and faces, but places. A shoreline lit with moons he did not know. A hall with doors that opened to nowhere, filled with voices singing without sound. A great loom, its frame the size of a ship, its threads made of mist and breath and echoes, and in its center, a hand, neither old nor young, weaving the broken circle again and again into the weft of the world. He began to understand that the rune, Skada, was not just a sign of what should not be spoken. It was a marker, a threshold, not between life and death, but between what is held and what is let go. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to carry something older than belief? Not to understand it, only to carry it. It was Svala who first said the word keeper. "You're not a skald," she said one evening as they watched the moon rise, "and not a priest. You don't serve the gods. You serve the pause between their names." Eric smiled softly. "That sounds like nothing." She turned toward him. "It is, but it's the kind of nothing that keeps everything else from falling apart." That night, he took the stones out again and laid them in a bowl of water beside his bed. When he dreamed, he did not see symbols. He saw threads, hundreds, thousands, all gently brushing past one another, each one glimmering slightly with a breath or name or moment. A child's laughter, a broken oath, a prayer whispered into salt wind, and one thread, darker than the rest, pulsing. The rune was not on the thread. The thread was the rune. He awoke with the taste of sea brine on his tongue and a faint tremble in his fingers. The next day, a woman arrived from a neighboring fjord. Her brother had drowned at sea, but his body had washed ashore with a strange carving in his palm. She had wrapped his hand in linen and brought it with her. Eric unwrapped the cloth slowly. The mark was faint but clear. A broken circle. A thorn. He looked at her. Did he know of the rune? She shook her head. He was only a net mender. He barely wrote his name. But as she said it, Svala, who had arrived silently as always, stepped forward. "It's spreading," she said softly. "The silence is unraveling." That night, Eric took the carved stone back to the cliff. The fog did not rise. The air was still. The sea whispered, but held no omen. He placed the stone where he had first carved the rune, traced it once more. Then he asked aloud, "What do you serve?" The wind answered with a pause, and then a voice, not Halvar's, not the stranger's, not his own, said, "You serve the remembering of forgetting." He stared at the stars above. This time, they did not shift, but he felt them settle, and in that quiet, he understood. The rune is not a warning. It is a responsibility, not to use, but to witness. It marks those who listen, truly listen, to what the world tries to bury. It does not give power. It does not grant vision. It gives only silence. And in that silence, the weight of all things unsaid. He left the stone there on the cliff. He never carved Skada again. But when others came to him, with dreams, with names, with symbols that made no sense, he listened. He listened to the silences between their words. He taught them the runes that breathed gently. Aiwas, for death and transition. Kinas, for the torch of seeing. Gebo, for the gift that binds and releases. But he never taught Skida. He only nodded if they spoke it themselves. Years passed. Eric aged slowly, the way those chosen by memory often do. He grew no gray, but his hands began to tremble slightly, not with weakness, but with the heaviness of all the threads he'd brushed in dreams. Svala grew as well, into a woman whose voice could still silence a room. She traveled to other villages, never calling herself a seer, never asking for coin. She listened. She remembered. And she always returned. And one winter evening, as snow fell in thick, slow flakes that hushed the roofs and fences, she came to Eric's hearth and said, "There's another." He looked up from the birchwood he was smoothing. "A child," she said. "He drew it into the snow without knowing what it was. He's not afraid." Eric said nothing, only stirred the fire. "What should I tell him?" she asked. And Eric, older now, hands worn from decades of listening, said quietly, "Tell him this. The rune does not ask to be followed, only honored." She nodded. Outside, the snow continued falling, and somewhere beneath the ice, the threads moved slowly, quietly, brushing past one another like fish in a dark river, never tangled, never still. And at the center of it all, the silent rune waited, not for worship, only for the next to listen. Tonight's welcome comes wrapped in the hush of snow melting on a windowsill, that slow, secret sound, like a sigh forgotten by the cold. Let it settle into your breath now, soft as a woolen shawl around your shoulders. The night has no questions for you, only a rhythm, only a story that doesn't rush. Years folded gently over the village. Nothing grand ever occurred there. No great wars, no gods walking openly, no blood carved into legend, but stories continued, quiet ones, of children born, of fields mended after frost, of nets mended by lamplight. The kind of stories no one sings, but which hold the world together just the same. Eirik no longer lived in the heart of the village. He had moved his dwelling to the edge of the forest, where the trees stood old and attentive, and where the wind had more room to speak between the boughs. The villagers still visited. Some brought carved antler or butter or news from the coast. Others brought questions, often without knowing what they sought. And he would listen, as always. He carved less now, though not from frailty. His hands were steady. But he found that his work had turned inward. It was no longer the rune that lived through his hands, but the silence it wove between his thoughts. Sometimes at night, he would wake and feel the weight of the carved stone still out there, resting in the circle of standing stones beneath the open sky. He had not returned to it since leaving it there, not because he feared it, but because it no longer needed him to hold it. It had found its place. Svala continued her quiet crossings between villages. Wherever she went, others began to speak of strange dreams, of patterns in frost and shadow that felt too deliberate to be mere weather. A few whispered of a rune that could not be spoken, only remembered. And always, she would say gently, do not fear it, just listen. And they would. One spring, she returned with a boy named Bren. He was 11, thin, sharp-eyed, hands always moving, not from nerves, but as if reaching for something just past the edge of sight. He did not speak much, but when he did, he often asked strange questions. Not rude, just deep. Why do stones remember more than we do? Do birds forget where they learned their songs? Is the wind a language that trees can read? Eric welcomed him with quiet tea and bread that had grown dry but not stale. The boy ate slowly, watching the smoke curl from the fire as if it were telling a story only he could hear. Later that night, Bren took a stick and drew in the earth outside the hut. Eric watched without interrupting. The boy drew a line, then another, bent, then a circle, but left it open, then a single stroke through its center like a spine. He had drawn Skada, without flinching. When he looked up, he only said, I dreamed of it walking through water. Eric crouched beside him. Did it speak? The boy shook his head. It listened. That night, Eric lay awake for a long time, listening to the wind among the trees. There were no signs, no omens, no thunder, just the steady breathing of the world. Have you ever felt something begin again, not in fire or revelation, but in the gentle repetition of an old rhythm returning? The next day, Eric brought Bren to the river bend, where the water slowed and pooled into a wide, quiet mirror. It was the place Halvar had once taken him, not to teach, but to wait. Put your hand in the water, Eric said. The boy did. Now speak a word you do not know. Bren frowned, and then, almost dreamily, he whispered, Oskir. The water rippled, though no wind stirred. Eric smiled faintly. He did not know the word either. But that did not matter. The rune had always been less about meaning than remembering. That summer, the dreams deepened. Not just for Eric or Bren, but for others. A shepherd woman in the next village dreamt of a loom strung with fish bones. A potter to the south carved a broken circle into a cup without realizing. An elder, blind since childhood, began humming a tune that, when traced in sound, mapped the rune exactly. It was not spreading, it was surfacing. Eirik began writing again, not for others, but for himself, not with ink, but in etched wax, scratched charcoal, threads sewn into bark. He recorded moments when the silence pulled taut, when the wind passed too slowly through the branches, when the birds lifted all at once without reason. Each time, the rune seemed to shimmer just at the edge of his sight, not to intrude, but to affirm. One evening, as twilight painted the forest in its soft blue hush, Svala brought word of an old cairn found toppled after a landslide in the mountains. Within it, they found a body long crumbled, bones wrapped in birch bark, and on the bark, pressed deep as if burned in, the same unknown rune. Not new, old, older than their tongue, older perhaps, than language. Svala's voice was low as she told it, not from fear, but reverence. What do you think it means? She asked him once again. Eric's hands rested in his lap. I think it means we are not the first to carry silence. She nodded, and then said, but maybe we are the first not to try and silence it back. That night, Bren sat beside the hearth and asked, why doesn't the rune have a god? Eric looked into the flames, and then said softly, because it belongs to the space before gods, or after. The boy tilted his head. Is that why it listens better than they do? And Eric laughed gently, the kind of laugh that unknots something you didn't know was tangled. Perhaps. Seasons shifted once more. Bren grew. Svala began gathering stories from beyond the fjords, and Eric carved again, not runes, but vessels, bowls, cups, flat stones, all smooth, all blank. He did not fill them. He left them waiting, because something else had begun to fill the spaces, not with sound, but with presence. People came not to be told what the rune meant, but simply to sit near its memory. They would walk among the stones, trace patterns in sand, fall asleep by fires that seemed warmer when the mark was near. It became less a symbol, more a space, a way of being. And one day, Bren asked if he could take a stone of his own to carve. Not a heavy one, just a river stone, smooth and pale. Eric handed him the blade Halvar had given him. The boy held it reverently, and without asking what to carve, he stepped into the trees. He returned the next morning. The blade was clean. The stone was silent. But when Eric traced his fingers over its surface, he felt the rune, not cut in, not burned, but present all the same. Not visible, but certain. It had not been carved. It had been invited. That day, Eric walked to the cliff one last time. The stone he'd left there years ago was gone. Not shattered, not buried. Gone. But in its place was a hollow in the granite, the exact shape of the rune, as if it had always been part of the stone. And he understood then. Some runes are not carved to be seen. They are carved to be remembered, to echo, to return. And Skada, the one rune you should never carve, is not dangerous because it brings power. It is dangerous because it brings silence. And silence remembers everything. Tonight, let your welcome come in the form of quiet rain tapping on a wooden roof. Soft, steady, patient. Each drop a word unspoken. Each rhythm a lullaby from the old world, older than iron or fire. Close your eyes, if they haven't already closed, and breathe with the sound of rain. We return now, without hurry, to the gentle unfolding of memory, where Irik's path continues not forward, but inward. The seasons after Bren carved his unseen rune passed without omen. The sky behaved as it always had, sometimes kind, sometimes cruel. The goats bore twins. The cod returned late. The boats came back with nets full enough for song, but not feasting. There was illness, too, in the early frost, but not more than the village could bear. Nothing struck the world as remarkable. Yet within that unremarkable rhythm, a current shifted. The children played differently. They began carving shapes into the mud after rain, not copying runes they'd seen, but inventing forms that felt familiar. They traced circles that didn't quite close, lines that branched like tree roots, dots that hovered like breath. They gave them no names, but when Erik asked what they meant, the children would shrug and say, "It just felt right." And sometimes, when he walked the village paths before dawn, he would find small bundles of moss or bark or shells left on stones. Offerings, but to whom? He did not ask. He had learned long ago that silence honors some truths better than naming them. Svala spent more time in the deep hills now. She would vanish for weeks, returning with weathered eyes and hands stained from roots. She brought stories of other places, places where runes had been found, not etched, but grown. Threads of vine wrapping around stones in patterns only the old ones could interpret. Cracks in glacier ice that, from above, shaped symbols no living hand had made. River bends that echoed names when no one spoke. One day, she returned with a question. "Do you remember the river cairn?" Eric nodded. The one they found toppled in the mountains? She sat, pulled her cloak tighter. I think it wasn't meant to be buried. He waited. They found another. Downriver. Upright. Perfect. Inside. Nothing. He felt the weight of her words settle in the space between them. No body? He asked. No, she said. Only a single stone, carved with a broken rune. But this one, she paused, choosing her words. This one was different. It wasn't cut in. It was worn. Worn, as if countless fingers had traced it, over generations. Eric closed his eyes for a moment. It was becoming clearer now. Not in logic, but in pattern. The rune was not a warning, not a curse, not even a name. It was a practice, a returning. Have you ever wondered if some knowledge is not discovered, but remembered, as if waking from a long dream you never knew you had? That autumn, a woman from the coast arrived in the village with a storm in her eyes. Her name was Ulna. She wore no clan colors. She had walked alone for 2 weeks through mountain fog and broken terrain, following a dream she could not shake. In it, she said, she saw 12 stones, and in the center, a child tracing a circle into the dirt. I know it wasn't me, she said to Eric, but I know I was meant to see it. Eric offered her a bowl of seaweed broth, rich with salt and smoke. She ate slowly. After, she asked if she might stay. Not forever, she said, just until I remember why I came. He nodded. By then, people had begun to arrive, not for carving, but for sitting. Some brought questions. Some brought grief. A few brought nothing but silence. And Eric would let them sit beside his hearth. No words needed. Sometimes they would hum. Sometimes they would sleep. Often, they would trace shapes into the ash or whisper fragments of dreams. No one judged. No one corrected. The longhouse became a threshold, not of stone or doorframe, but of stillness. Svala called it the house between. And one day, she whispered, I think this is what Halvar began. Eric's eyes misted. He had not spoken Halvar's name in years, but the shape of it still lived in his breath. I think it's what came before Halvar, he said. And then, and before that, and before even names had weight. Svala nodded. And now? He smiled, lines around his eyes folding like pages in a well-loved book. Now, we're only remembering the remembering. The first true storm came that winter. Not of snow, but rain. Weeks of it. The sky broke open like a cracked vessel, and the hills turned to rivers, and the rivers to lakes. Trees leaned under the weight. Fields drowned. Boats were dragged into barns, and the villagers huddled indoors, their fires dim, their dreams louder. Eric's roof held, but more than 50 people, friends, strangers, elders, wanderers, came to his hearth. Not because they had nowhere else to go, but because they were drawn. They said little. They slept in shifts. They offered what food they had. No songs were sung. No argument sparked. The silence was thick, but never heavy, and each night, as the rain stitched long threads across the roof, Eric sat by the door with the blade Halvar had given him, not carving, but holding, listening, and the rune hummed again, not as it once had, sharply, like a warning. Now it hummed like a lullaby beneath the surface of a lake. One night, during the worst of the rain, Bren woke screaming. It was the first sound to break the hush in days. He trembled, sweat beating on his neck, eyes wide. Eric knelt beside him. What did you see? The boy whispered, the river beneath names. Eric did not ask what that meant. He simply placed his hand on the boy's chest and breathed until the trembling stopped. The next morning, The rain ceased. The sky did not clear, but the world exhaled, and the villagers emerged from the longhouse, blinking, stretching, silent. No one thanked Eric. They simply nodded, each carrying the weight of something gentle and wordless. That spring, the moss grew thicker around the standing stones. Eric visited again for the first time in many years. The 12 stones still stood, but now, between them, small carvings dotted the earth, left by others. Not runes of power, not cries for help, but tokens, shapes, rememberings, circles drawn halfway, threads etched like veins, and in the center, not his stone, not Bren's, nothing, just bare earth, untouched, waiting. He knelt, not to carve, but to sit, and for the first time in his life, he heard not silence, but language beneath silence, not in words, not even in meaning, but in rhythm. The wind passed through the circle like a loom string pulled taut, a thread drawn between stars, and he whispered, not to the gods, not to the rune, but to the rhythm. I serve the breath between. He stood, the blade still in his hand, and left it there, beside the central stone. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to whoever next remembered how to listen. Hush now, patient dreamer. Tonight's greeting comes with the soft stretch of twilight across skin, that warm slip of dusk light as it settles over hills and shoulders alike. Not quite gone, not quite day, just the breath between. This is the hour when things shift quietly, and so we return gently to the quiet world where silence is no longer empty, but full of threads. It had been many years since Eric had first carved the rune. Though time passed gently in the village, it passed all the same. The blacksmith's boy had grown into a man with his own forge. Svala's hair had silver in it now, though her voice remained clear, her presence steady. Bren stood taller than Eric, but still returned each week to sit beside him in silence, like a ritual neither of them ever questioned. And Eirik himself, older now, yes, but not diminished. His steps were slower, yet surer. His voice had softened, but it held weight. The villagers no longer asked for carvings. They asked for presence, for witnessing, for words left unspoken. And so the days unfolded like linen drying in sunlight, simple, slow, necessary. It was during one of those long afternoons, while sitting beneath the eaves of his hut and watching a line of ants carry a feather across the stone path, that Eric first heard the hum, not with his ears. It came from the earth itself, a low, steady rhythm, not sound, exactly, but sensation, as if the ground were speaking through his bones. He placed both hands on the moss, closed his eyes, and listened. In that hush, he saw threads, not imagined, real, thin as hair, shining faintly, rising through the earth like steam. They moved not with the wind, but with breath. Each exhale from his chest tugged gently at one, and each tug answered. He opened his eyes and knew it was time to go. He didn't pack food. He didn't leave a message. He only took a small wooden bowl, carved years ago during one of the silent winters, and the wool cloak Halvor had once wrapped around the forbidden rune. As he passed through the village, no one stopped him, but many watched. Some nodded. Some lowered their gaze in quiet understanding. Bren, waiting at the edge of the tree line, walked with him a short way. Neither spoke. When they reached the stream where the rushes grew in thick green mats, Bren paused and offered Eric a single white stone. Round, smooth, uncarved. Eric took it, and Bren returned. The path led west into the low hills where trees grew gnarled and bent from wind and age. There were no trails, only faint memories of deer paths and stories passed between grandmothers. But Eric knew where he was going, even if he had never walked there before. The ground grew softer, the wind cooler, and as night fell, he came to a clearing. At its center stood a loom. Not a loom of human hands. No timber, no pegs, no cord. But a structure shaped from bone-white stone, curved and interlocked in a way that defied explanation. Across it stretched threads, woven not of wool or flax, but of breath and shadow and memory. They shimmered only when not looked at directly. He stepped into the clearing and sat. Not at the loom itself, but beside it, to watch. For the first time in his life, he understood that this was not a place of doing. It was a place of being, of holding space. And the rune, Skida, was not meant to be carved again and again. It was meant to be held. One thread crossed before him, delicate, pale gold, and hummed with memory. He reached out, not to grasp, but to brush. And in that brush, a vision passed through him. A woman in a time long before, her hands soaked with river clay, humming a song that had no words as she shaped the first bowl. Not for food, but for caring silence. Another thread, a whisper of silver. A man walking across desert stone, barefoot, each footstep a prayer. The rune drawn not in sand, but in sweat that fell from his brow. He did not know its shape, only its pull. Another, a child, somewhere distant in time, weeping without sound in a field of ash, drawing circles into dust with a stick, not to summon, but to remember what once was. The loom pulsed gently, not with power, but with presence. Eric wept, not in sorrow, not in joy, but in understanding. Have you ever sat at the center of something that asked nothing of you, and yet gave you everything? The night passed slowly. Time ceased to mark itself. Eric did not sleep, but he did not need to. He was held in the rhythm of breath and thread, and in that place he did not age. He simply listened. And then, as gently as a candle snuffing itself out, the loom quieted. The thread stilled, and one final breath passed through the clearing. A voice, older than language, said only, "Now you remember?" Eric stood. The morning light spilled through the trees, silver and green. The clearing was empty. No loom, no thread, only him. And in his hands, the bowl was full. He looked down. Inside it lay the white stone Brent had given him. But now, faintly, impossibly, the rune was there. Not carved, not burned, but held in the grain of the stone itself, like a seed waiting for rain. He walked back slowly. When he reached the village, no one asked where he had been. But Svala met him at the gate. She touched his hand and nodded. From that day on, Eirik no longer carved at all. But people came just the same. They came to sit, to breathe, to let go, and he would offer them the bowl. They would hold it. Nothing more. Some wept. Some dreamed. Some fell into sleep so deep the earth itself seemed to cradle them. And always, when they returned the bowl, they would pause. Look at the stone, not to read it, but to remember it. And they would leave different, not healed, not changed, just quieter, as if something inside them had been untangled, one thread at a time. Eric never left the village again. He grew older, yes. His hair thinned, his hands stiffened, his voice rasped like bark, but the silence within him never dimmed. It pulsed quietly, like the rune, like the loom, like the breath between all things. And when he died, one morning before the frost had left the window panes, the bowl was passed to Svala. She placed no stone inside it. She waited, And days later, a young girl, one of the village twins, brought a small stone she had found by the stream. "Is this one?" she asked. Svala took it, held it, and smiled. "Yes." Let the evening enter now with the hush of footsteps across frost. Not hurried, not loud, but the soft, deliberate pacing of someone walking through a dream. The sky has gone pale with starlight, and the air carries the stillness that only lingers after something old has passed on. Settle into this hush, gentle listener. Let it wrap around you. Tonight, we return to a village that knows how to remember. The girl's name was Ilsa. She was 8 the first time she saw the bowl. Her parents had brought her to Svala not out of fear, but uncertainty. Ilsa was not sick. She was not troubled. But she had begun to speak in strange half-sentences at dawn, as if continuing conversations no one else had started. "She says she dreams of threads," her mother said, voice hushed. "But not the kind for weaving. She says they hum." Svala made no promise, offered no remedies. She only smiled her quiet smile and invited them to stay the night. In the dim hush of the hearth's glow, Ilsa sat across from the bowl. It was nothing special, at first glance. An old wooden dish, smooth with years of touch, lined with a single white stone no larger than a walnut. But the moment her eyes met the stone, her body stilled. Not frozen in fear, stilled like a lake. She leaned forward, very slowly, then whispered, "That's where the forgetting lives." Svala looked at her for a long time, then simply said, "Would you like to hold it?" Ilsa did. Her fingers, small and cold, cupped the bowl with care. She did not speak again for some time. The fire crackled low. Outside, the trees sighed in the windless dark. Finally, she asked, "Is it waiting for someone?" Svala tilted her head. "What do you think?" "I think it doesn't wait like a person waits," Ilsa murmured. "It waits like a tree waits, or like silence. It just is." And then she gave the bowl back. After that night, Svala watched her closely. Not with suspicion, but with attention. Ilsa did not change dramatically. She still played with her brother, still fetched water, still giggled when the goats escaped their fence. But sometimes, when no one was watching, she would stop mid-step, eyes unfocused, as though listening to something only she could hear. The others in the village noticed too. They began calling her the little threadwalker, a name said with affection, more than worry. She did not seem burdened. If anything, she seemed lighter than most, unbothered by the daily weights of hunger or chores or squabbles, as if her thoughts always existed one breath beyond the present. By the time she was 10, she had begun tracing shapes in frost, not runes, not quite, but marks, gentle spirals, half circles, lines that turned inward and stopped, as if folding into silence. One morning, as winter receded into a hesitant spring, Svala took her to the stones. The 12 still stood, moss-covered and wind-smoothed, holding their circle like always. Time had not worn them down. It had only made them quieter. Ilsa stepped between them with bare feet, despite the chill. She didn't speak. She walked to the center and knelt, pressing her palm to the earth. She stayed that way for a long while, and when she rose, she looked to Svala and asked softly, "Can you take me to the place where the threads are born?" Svala did not ask how she knew. Instead, she whispered, "Not yet. First, you must learn the breath beneath the breath." For a year, Ilsa came to the longhouse each evening, not to be taught, but to sit. Sometimes she helped grind roots. Sometimes she listened to the wind whistle through the beams. Sometimes she slept. But always, she kept her hands near the bowl. And slowly, ever so slowly, the villagers began to feel something different when they entered the space. The hush was deeper. The fire cracked more softly. Even silence had softened its edges. One night, a woman came with her newborn swaddled in wool. The baby had not cried once since birth. The mother was afraid, though the child was warm, healthy, alert. Ilse approached without speaking. She cupped the baby's head in both her hands, eyes closed. A long silence followed. And then the child exhaled, a long, slow breath, as though releasing something ancient. Moments later, it began to wail. A healthy, full-throated cry that brought tears to its mother's eyes. Ilse stepped back and whispered. He was holding someone else's breath. No one questioned it, not anymore. Have you ever met a child who does not grow older in the same way others do, not because of some curse or miracle, but because they were never quite made of just years? By 12, Ilse had begun to speak the old words, not learned ones, felt ones, words shaped like water through stone. She called the loom Elharn. She called the silence the second sky. She called the rune by no name at all, only the hollow thread. One evening, Svala placed the blade, Halvar's old worn blade, into Ilse's hands. Ilse turned it over once and said, "It doesn't need me to carve. It needs me to close." Svala breathed in through her nose, steady, calm. "What does that mean, child?" Ilse looked at the fire, then answered, "I don't know yet, but the loom will." It was time to return, not just to the clearing, but to what lived beyond it. The journey was longer than when Eric had first walked it. The forest had grown thicker, the wind less certain. It took 3 days to reach the place. Svala and Ilse walked in silence. When they arrived, the clearing appeared much as it had before. Simple, quiet, but the loom was gone, or so it seemed. Until Ilse stepped to the center and sat. Then slowly, slowly, like mist forming shape, the loom returned. Not of stone, this time, but of light and breath, and it began to hum. Svala could not hear it, but she felt it, in her teeth, in her bones, in her blood. Ilse reached into her satchel and removed a thread, not wool, not fiber, a thread made of something unseen, invisible, but real. She tied it around the blade's hilt, then whispered something no one but the trees heard, and the loom stopped humming. Everything held still, even the birds in the branches, even the wind. Ilse rose. The blade was gone. So was the thread. So was the weight. She turned to Svala and said only, "It's woven now." They returned to the village. Ilse did not speak of it again, but the bowl felt lighter, the stone somehow clearer. And when the next child came with the rune burned behind his eyes, he did not weep. He only smiled and said, "I dreamed of the loom." Svala touched his shoulder gently and whispered, "So did we." Tonight, come gently into the story, like a hand trailing through tall summer grasses. The warmth still lingers in the blades, and the breeze carries the scent of old rain and open sky. Let each breath you take feel like a hush between heartbeats, long, slow, and listening. We walk now into a season of soft turning, where the world does not speak louder, only deeper. Ilse no longer wandered far. She remained in the village most days, quiet and calm, never idle, but never hurried. The children still called her by name, though even they had grown to lower their voices around her, without knowing why. It wasn't reverence. It was respect of a different kind, the kind the forest gives to old trees. Not for their age, but for the way they hold stillness. She helped mend roofs, watched over lambs, ground root into powder for winter tonics. And yet, even in those small acts, there was a listening about her, a pausing between gestures, as if everything she touched had to speak first before she could answer. The white stone remained in the bowl. It had not changed, but when people held it now, they did. Svala had seen it over and over. The baker who held it and afterward spoke, for the first time, of a grief he'd buried since his brother drowned. A boy of 6 who held it and then slept for 3 days, waking with no fever and eyes somehow older. A hunter who confessed he no longer wished to take life and left the forest forever. None of these changes were dramatic. No thunder, no fire. Just the soft, slow settling of threads that had been twisted for too long. Even the animals felt it. Goats lingered longer at the threshold. Birds nested closer. The village dogs often slept in the doorway, as if drawn to the breath of the stone. One day, Ilse rose early, before dawn, and walked into the field beyond the eastern path, the one where no crops had grown for years, where the soil was poor and the wind always slightly colder. People said it was cursed, but in truth, they simply avoided it. It was the kind of land that didn't ask to be claimed. She walked out into its center and sat. No one followed her, but from a distance, many watched. She stayed there through the morning, through noon, through the falling of the first cool wind of early autumn. She did not speak, did not sing, only Saturday. By the time the moon rose, a strange thing had happened. The field began to hum, not with sound, but with presence. The wind moved differently through it now. The grasses shifted in patterns that felt deliberate, not eerie, not wrong, just attentive, like the whole field had leaned in to listen. Svala approached only after dark, when the stars were high and no sound, but the wind remained. She brought the bowl and set it before Ilse. Ilse did not open her eyes. She only whispered, "It's ready." "For what?" Svala asked softly. Ilse breathed in, then said, "To hold what the others leave behind." And the next day, they began to come, one by one, then in pairs, then families. Not with questions, not for carvings, but to sit. The villagers began calling it the listening field. It was never called sacred. That wasn't the right word. It wasn't a shrine. It was a place where silence met you fully, without turning away. Some brought items to leave behind. A button from a lost sister's tunic, a lock of hair from a child buried in spring, a broken flute, a cracked stone. Not offerings, not prayers, only rememberings. They buried them gently in the earth. Ilse never told them what to bring. She never asked. She only waited. And when the field was empty, she walked the perimeter, barefoot, her fingers trailing through the tall grass like they were reading its braille. The bowl stayed with her always, and in time, people began to notice something. The field, the one long thought barren, had begun to change. The soil smelled richer. Earthworms curled beneath the surface. The wind no longer bit with chill. And one spring, a soft blue flower bloomed in the very center. No one had planted it. No one had seen it before. It had 5 petals, each shaped like a listening ear. Svala smiled when she saw it, and said, "Now the silence is listening back." Have you ever stood in a place where even your thoughts quieted, as though the air itself asked you to speak slower, or not at all? The girl, Ilse, grew slowly, like the field, like the bowl, like the rune. At 16, she looked as she had at 12, only taller, and with a gaze that stayed steady even when people wept in front of her. At 17, she no longer needed words. Most who came to her found their own. At 18, she began to teach others how to listen, not with ears, but with hands, with feet, with the way your body slows when you walk among trees. Not all were ready, but those who were stayed. They began tending the field, not shaping it, but witnessing it. They removed no weeds. They plowed no rows. They left the flowers where they grew, the moss where it gathered. One girl began composing music from the rhythm of wind through its grasses. One boy sculpted bowls that echoed the weight of the original, not copies, but responses. An old woman began translating silence into thread, weaving patterns only her fingers understood, and none of them spoke of the rune, not because it was forbidden, but because it had already been spoken, by the field, the bowl, the breath between. One night, Ilse sat at the edge of the stones once more. The stars above her were steady. No shifting, no signs, only stillness. Svala joined her, older now, with hands gnarled from age, but spirit bright as ever. They sat without speaking for a long time. Then Svala asked, "Do you know what comes next?" Ilse didn't answer at first. She reached down, picked up a small stone, pressed her thumb into the dirt, and drew a single curve. It did not close. It did not speak. But it was the shape of breath, the shape of letting go. Then she whispered, "It's not about what comes next. It's about what continues." And Svala, eyes full of both sorrow and peace, nodded, for she knew what Ilse meant. The rune did not end. It did not complete. It threaded itself through hands and looms, fields and bowls, breath and bone, not to be finished, but to keep weaving. And long after Eric's name was no longer spoken, long after the field had changed again, and again, and again, there would be children who sat in that soil, hands open, listening, not for stories, but for the space where stories are born. Welcome once more, quiet heart. Tonight's arrival carries the hush of footsteps in a room where someone has just left. The warmth still lingers, though no breath stirs the air. It's a gentle emptiness, not lonely, but sacred. Let it guide you inward, like stepping into a room you remember from childhood, where silence greets you like an old friend. We continue now, slowly, where silence leads. Years in the village did not arrive like bells or banners. They slipped in like mist over the ridgeline, unnoticed until the light shifted. Seasons still turned, but more gently now. Fewer raised voices, fewer hard winters. The land had not grown softer, but the people had grown quieter with it. The listening field thrived, not in the way of crops or cattle, but in something deeper. Children played near its edges, but never shouted across it. Wanderers came without maps. No signs pointed to it, and yet none ever got lost. Even birds seemed to circle lower overhead, as if pulled by something their wings remembered. Ilse, by now, had become the shape of the field. She no longer led or taught in the way elders once did. She simply moved through the days like someone walking through water, each step part of a rhythm older than feet. She still lived in the small house at the field's northern edge, where the trees leaned slightly in toward the earth. The original bowl sat undisturbed on the wide window ledge, the white stone untouched. Visitors were free to hold it. Most only needed to touch it once. A few never did. And then came the boy with no name. It was late in the season, a dusk of yellow leaves and wood smoke. The village fire had just begun to crackle, and the day's last warmth slipped between shadows. The boy appeared without warning, barefoot, hair matted with travel, his eyes alert and ancient all at once. He carried no satchel, no blade, just a thread. It was knotted at both ends, no longer than a span across a man's palm, and woven from something not quite plant, not quite wool. It shimmered slightly in the dusk light, not with shine, but with memory. When Ilse saw it, she did not ask his name. Instead, she said, "You've come to unfasten it." The boy nodded once, then placed the thread in her hands. It was warm. Have you ever held something that felt like it was remembering you? Ilse took the thread and laid it gently in the bowl. The white stone did not move. But the air in the room tightened, just for a moment, like the pause between thunder and rain. The boy spoke his first words then. "It's been passed through 6 hands." Ilse looked at him. "Since when?" He blinked slowly. "Since it was closed." The meaning folded into her at once, not in language, but in pulse. The blade, the loom, the final knot that sealed the breath of the rune so long ago. It had not ended the thread. It had only slowed it, hidden it, let it sleep. But now it stirred again. She said nothing, only nodded. And from the day, the boy remained. He slept in the grass behind the house, even in cold. He ate little. He asked no questions. He followed where Ilse walked, not as shadow, not as servant, but as a second rhythm, a harmony beneath hers. People began to speak of him as the unfastener. They whispered that he came to undo what even silence could not hold forever. And in time, it became clear. He was not here to teach or speak or lead. He was here to remember the forgetting. Svala, older now, with hair like river ice and hands lined deep as bark, came one final time to the field. She sat with Ilse under the dusk and watched the boy trace his fingers through the moss. "He carries the edge," she said softly. Ilse didn't reply. "You've carried the center," Svala continued. "But he's where things fray." The stars began to appear above the treetops. "He's where the next weaving begins," Ilse said at last. "Have you ever seen a story shift without ending? Not torn, not broken, but slowly rethreading itself into a new shape? That winter, the snow came early. Not with violence, but with quiet insistence. It covered the listening field in a single night, blanketing every stone and blade of grass. And in the white silence that followed, something else emerged. Footprints. Not human. Not animal. Shapes too round, too soft, too evenly spaced, like memories walking. Each morning, a new path, winding through the snow, always toward the center of the field, and always vanishing. No one followed them. No one dared. But they watched. They listened. And over time, they began to dream. All of them, villagers and visitors alike, of looms with no spindles, of hands that left no prints, of songs sung without mouths. One by one, they stopped calling it a field. They began to call it the hollow place, a name not born of fear, but of reverence. It was no longer simply where silence listened. It had become where silence spoke back. The boy did not change in the way others did. His hair never grayed, his gait never slowed. But the way he moved grew more deliberate. Each gesture held space. He became a pause shaped into flesh. One morning, he brought Ilse a second stone, dark gray, smooth, without a mark. He placed it beside the white one in the bowl and simply said, "It's time." Ilse looked at the 2 stones, and she knew, one to hold memory, one to release it. That night, she walked to the center of the hollow place. She sat. The snow did not melt beneath her. but it hummed. The stars overhead did not move, but they watched, and the boy sat across from her, placing the thread between them, the one he had carried since he arrived. Its knots remained. Ilsa reached forward and held one end. The boy held the other. They pulled, not with force, but with breath. And slowly, the knot unfurled, not into string, not into fiber, but into wind. The thread dissolved, and the wind around them shifted, not into storm, not into silence, but into space. Something unbound had been remembered. Something remembered had been let go. The next morning, the bowl held no stones, and no one could recall whether it ever had. Ilsa remained in the village, but she was no longer seen often. The house at the edge of the hollow place grew quiet. Flowers still bloomed in spring. Birds still nested beneath the roof, but the door stayed closed. The boy, now simply the one who walks the edge, tended the field. He spoke little, but the way he stepped, the way he paused before each crossing breeze, told the story well enough. And the field no longer waited. It held. It held the weight of all that had been remembered and released, and those who sat there, whether for an hour or a season, left lighter. Not because their burdens had been taken, but because the thread no longer tangled. The rune, the broken circle, the thorn through breath, was no longer carved. It had been woven into story, into place, into silence itself. Tonight, let your welcome come on the back of a breath you didn't know you were holding. The kind that leaves the body not with strain, but with release. The room is still, the world outside dim and tender. There are no demands here, only a slow return. We drift now, as gently as a falling leaf, back into the hollow place, where forgetting is a kind of remembering. The bowl remained empty. No one placed stones in it anymore, and no one asked why. Those who visited the hollow place no longer needed objects to guide them. They sat in the field with open hands, or sometimes with hands buried deep in the soil, fingers curling around roots as if touching the threads beneath the threads. The boy, now a man in form, though time did not seem to shape him as it did others, continued to walk the perimeter each morning. He carried no staff, no blade, no bag, only silence. And yet, those who watched him sensed he held more than most men could ever name. He had become something between witness and wind, not leading, not following, simply present. If you asked him where the rune lived now, he might have said, under your breath, between your words, at the center of your waiting. Ilsa no longer opened her door. She was still seen, from time to time, walking the edge of the tree line, gathering herbs, watching the sunrise, her fingers lightly grazing tall grass, as if reading it. But she no longer came to the gatherings. She no longer needed to. It was said she now carried the loom within her, that wherever she stepped, the air wove itself into new shapes. No one asked her to speak anymore. But when she did, rarely, quietly, it was said that the words lingered in the air long after her voice fell silent, like a scent in an old garment, like the warmth from hands that had long since left the room. The village had changed, though not in ways marked by stone or law. People moved slower, listened longer. They did not build higher fences or dig deeper wells. They grew gardens with curved rows. They painted their homes with ash and herb, not for show, but for memory. They whispered old lullabies to children that had no source, no known author, and yet everyone remembered them. And in the hollow place, the soil grew softer, not loamy, not rich in the way a farmer might hope, but soft in the way a story grows when left unforced. Moss took root without permission. Wildflowers bloomed in shapes that echoed old runes no one had drawn in years. Birds nested in the stones without fear. No animal was hunted there, no crops planted. It was not sacred. It was simply held. Have you ever stood in a place that does not ask anything of you, not even reverence, and found yourself weeping, though you didn't know why? One day, a traveler arrived, not a seeker, just a man with sore feet, a cracked water flask, and a memory that trailed behind him like a frayed rope. He had not meant to find the village. He had only followed the silence, and when he saw the field, he stopped walking. He didn't ask for food or shelter. He only knelt in the grass and wept. No one interrupted him. The boy, now the man at the edge, watched, then stepped forward and placed a hand on his shoulder. The traveler whispered, "I don't remember who I was." And the answer, given gently, was, "You don't need to." The traveler stayed. He built no house. He took no role. He simply remained. Each morning, he walked the field's edge, not tracing it, not guarding it, just walking. And over time, others came like him. Some stayed, some left. None were asked why. Because in the rhythm of the hollow place, every question became its own answer. It was not a place of learning. It was a place of unbinding. Ilse watched it all unfold from a distance. And one morning, as the wind shifted, as it always did, just before the first frost, she woke with a knowing. She dressed in wool, braided her hair back, lit no fire, then stepped out barefoot into the morning mist. She did not go to the hollow place. She walked the forest trail, the one few use now, until she came to a hill she had not climbed in years. At the top was a stone, plain, weathered, just large enough to sit upon. She sat. The wind circled her ankles. The trees did not move. And in that stillness, she let go. Not of life, not of thought, but of breath. One long final exhale that did not end. She did not die. Not in the way people usually do, but she stopped. Stopped being a center. Stopped being a name. When they found her, much later, her body was not there. Only her cloak, folded, and beneath it, a bowl. Carved from riverwood, smooth, light, and hollow. Inside it, a single thread, not woven, not knotted, just resting. The villagers did not mourn. They gathered in the hollow place that dusk, sat in a wide circle, and breathed together. No one spoke her name, but her presence threaded through every silence, every still hand, every unhurried heart. The boy, now no longer only boy or man, took the bowl and placed it in the center of the field. He did not place anything inside it. He did not speak, and the wind curled through the grass like a sigh of understanding. From that day forward, no one tended the field, because it no longer needed tending. It remembered itself. Children grew into elders, never having heard the rune spoken, and yet they knew its shape when they traced their fingers through river mud. They knew how to sit with grief without solving it, how to walk into silence without fear, how to let things end without needing them to be explained. The rune, the hollow circle, the thorn, the breath that breaks, was no longer carved, because it was no longer separate. It had become part of the soil, of the pause before speech, of the space between people, of the rhythm beneath memory. And sometimes, when the mist clung low and the stars shone with that quiet ache, people would say they heard a loom, far off, threading nothing into everything. Tonight, let your welcome arrive like the light beneath closed eyelids. soft, dim, weightless, not seen, but felt. You are not asked to understand, only to rest. We return now to a world where silence no longer waits to be noticed, but walks beside those who know how to listen. The thread continues, though no one weaves it anymore. It simply grows. The bowl remained in the field's center, untouched. It was not a shrine. No one guarded it. Rain pooled inside it in spring. Snow nestled. In its curve, come winter. Children were told not to play near it, not from fear, but from understanding. They obeyed, not with hesitation, but with reverence too quiet to name. The bowl never filled. It never emptied. It was simply there. In the village, no one led. There were those who healed, those who mended roofs, those who carved, those who baked, but no one claimed the center. No one replaced Ilsa. She had not left a gap. She had become part of the rhythm, no longer a note, but the silence between them. And yet, change came. It always does. The young grew restless. Not many, just a few. Boys and girls who had been born long after the carving of the rune, after the bowl's quieting, after the loom's last breath. They were not unkind, not loud, but they were curious in a way that edged outward. What lies beyond the ridgeline? Why does the field hum when we sleep near it? Is the rune only a story to keep us still? These were not the questions of rebellion. They were the questions of stirring. One of them, a girl named Maylin, had eyes like river slate and a voice like wind in tall grass. She spoke rarely, but when she did, the village listened. She did not reject the field. She walked its edge often. She sat in its hush and heard the bowl's breathless weight. But she also watched the horizon. One evening, after the day's last light had slipped behind the hills, she approached the edgewalker. He had not spoken much in recent seasons. His hair was silver now, though his face had not aged. Malin bowed, out of respect, and asked only one thing. "Is there a path that does not lead back?" The man looked at her a long while, and then to her surprise, smiled. "There is." She waited. He gestured west, not toward the forest, but beyond it, the lowlands, the old stones, the paths no one followed. No one had ever been forbidden to leave, but most simply, never did. Malin turned to go. He placed a single hand on her shoulder. "You must go without naming." She nodded and left at dawn. She carried no talisman, no blade, only a single thread wrapped around her wrist, taken from the bowl's edge. Not woven, not knotted, just loose. No one stopped her. Some watched her walk the path beyond the fields. Others turned away. A few wept, but no one followed. She passed the ridgeline before dusk and disappeared into the gray beyond. No one knew what she found, but after she left, dreams in the village began to change. Not nightmares, not omens, just wider. People dreamed of rivers they had never walked, of languages that did not use sound, of windmills turning without wind, of looms that spun not fabric, but memory. And the field began to shift again, subtly. The bowl, once still, now tilted slightly with each new moon, always in the same direction. West. Children began leaving offerings once more, not to honor, but to echo. A stone carved with wind ripple marks, a folded leaf pressed with the shape of a breath, a feather tied in a circle with hair. These were not objects of faith. They were replies. Have you ever spoken to something that never answers with words, and yet you know you've been heard? Months passed, then seasons, then 2 full winters. Malin did not return, but one spring morning, a boy no older than 8 wandered into the village from the western path. He was not frightened. He wore no shoes, and on his wrist was a thread, tied not once, but twice. 2 loops, one loose, one pulled tight. He came to the bowl, placed a pebble inside, then sat. The villagers asked him no questions. He offered no name, only a story, told slowly, without urgency, and without structure, like someone remembering water from a dream. He spoke of fields made of light and rooms without walls, of people who listened by placing their hands in soil, of a place where the rune was not a shape, but a direction, where silence moved. He said Malin had taught him how to hear what was beneath forgetting. He said she had not died. She had simply become another bowl, another hollow, another thread. And then he slept, curled beside the bowl in the hollow place, like a stone returned to its river. The next day, he was gone. No one saw him leave, but the bowl now held 2 pebbles and a faint outline of a rune, not carved, not scratched, but pressed into its grain, as if from weight alone. Not skata. Something new. Something turned inward. A circle closed, but not sealed. A mark that asked nothing and reminded everything. After that, the field became more than a place of listening. It became a place of remembering forward. People came not just with grief or questions, but with beginnings. They brought no burdens. They brought threads, unfinished ones, not to be woven, only to be noticed. Ilsa's name was still remembered, not spoken often, but kept in the breath of those who had once sat beside her. And the edgewalker, older now than most remembered, still passed the bowl each day. He touched it, never lifted it. And one day, like Ilsa before him, he simply stopped being seen. No cloak, no sign, only the slight shift of wind in the grass, and the feeling that something important had just moved, not away, but within. The rune no longer needed hands. It had become air. Tonight, I welcome you with the hush of a doorway half open, not waiting for you to cross, not inviting or urging, simply being there. A stillness that does not block, but watches. Step through only as far as you wish. There is no end here, only a deeper unfolding. And so we return, not to where we left off, but to where the thread next reveals itself. The hollow place was no longer a place alone. Its hush had stretched outward, not in lines or fences, but in the way breath passes from one room to the next. The village still had shape, paths, homes, gardens, fires. But even those had begun to curve gently, bending in slow arcs, as though orbiting the silence at the center of things. The children did not learn the rune. They learned something gentler, the art of waiting. They were taught not to answer too quickly, to let a question breathe. They learned to recognize when a pause meant more than a reply. They learned how to hold their hands open beneath rain, not to catch it, but to feel its weight. The white bowl in the field, older now, its grain darkened by years of weather, still held the small pebble and the faint inward circle. But people no longer placed things in it. They sat near it, or watched it from the trees, or dreamed of it and whispered their dreams into the moss. Some said the bowl was no longer a bowl, that it had become a mirror, one that only showed what you had not yet said aloud. Others claimed it hummed in the hours just before dawn, when the wind forgot its name and the stars blinked slower. But most said nothing at all. They simply sat beside it. Malin's name returned like a wind that remembers the valley it once loved. No one saw her, but they spoke of her again. gently, with eyes turned westward. Sometimes they would find marks in the earth, small spirals traced into mud after rain, or patterns of bent grass that resembled braids or waves. Never enough to prove, always enough to trust. It was said that she had become the one who walked through, not across, not around, not between, but through the rune itself. That she had learned the final turn of the thread, not to tie, but to open. And it was a young girl named Runa who said it best. She was 6 when she first sat alone in the hollow place for a full day. No one told her to. No one stopped her. When she returned, her face was calm, but her voice trembled. Not with fear, but with the way a flute trembles after song. She said, "The rune isn't broken, it's a gate." No one laughed. No one doubted. That night, the wind turned warm and did not stop for 3 days. The next morning, the bowl was gone. No sign of footprints, no disturbance of soil, just a circle of moss where it had rested, perfectly green and pulsing with dew. People gathered, slowly, uncertain whether to mourn or to breathe easier. It was Sela, the elder weaver, who finally spoke. Perhaps it was never meant to be kept. And no one disagreed. Because by then, the rune had settled into the way people lived. They no longer needed a shape. They had learned the pattern. Paths curved inward before bending away. Homes had windows on every side, not for light, but for listening. Meals began with silence and ended with song, not performed, just hummed together, mouths closed, hearts open. And when someone passed, as they always did, whether in age or in wandering, their name was not spoken in grief. It was spoken in breath, whispered once, then left to settle like dust on sun-warmed stone. Even visitors changed. They did not arrive asking questions anymore. They came to walk the perimeter, to sit with the wind, to lie beneath the stars until they heard whatever part of themselves had been quiet for too long. Some stayed, some did not. But all left something behind. A feather caught in bark, a ribbon tied to a sapling, a line of water poured slowly into the earth. Not offerings, not rituals, just presence made visible. Have you ever known a place where no one speaks louder than the birdsong? Not from fear, but because the quiet is already full? There was no record of who began the listening garden. It simply appeared, a winding trail of soft stones and herbs, each bend marked by a shape too fluid to be a rune, but too deliberate to be chance. People walked it barefoot, eyes lowered, hands open. Some said it led nowhere. Others said it always led to where you began. One evening, a boy of 9 traced the entire path in silence. When he returned, he sat beside his grandmother's stool and said, "It told me the whole story without words." She asked what the story was. He smiled, then said nothing. And somehow she understood. That was the way of things now. The rune had left its shape behind, but not its presence. It lived in the way people paused before interrupting, in the way wind chimes hung without ringing, in the way a child placed their hand on a stone and whispered, "Thank you," without knowing to whom. And still, sometimes, Malin was seen. Not clearly, not close. Just a figure standing at the far edge of the listening garden, beyond the last bend, where the trees thickened and the trail faded into dusk. She never spoke. She never waved. But those who glimpsed her said they felt finished. Not ended, not dismissed, just gently complete. And it became understood. The rune, Skyda, though it was no longer called by that name, had not been a warning, nor a danger, nor even a secret. It had been a beginning, a gentle breach in the weave of forgetting, a breath so ancient it could only be remembered when nothing else remained. The bowl had held it once, the stone had carried its pulse, but the true vessel had always been the pause, the breath before meaning, the hollow in the circle, the moment before return. And so, the village, no longer simply a village, but something quieter and wider, carried the thread not in hand, not in symbol, but in rhythm. And the loom, the loom. It had not vanished. It had become the field, the silence, the pause in your own breath, even now, even here, especially here. Tonight's welcome arrives not on a voice, but on a breath exhaled softly beside you, the kind that makes the candle flicker just slightly before going still again. Let your thoughts settle now, like dust in an old barn's beam light. You are not being asked to understand. You are only being asked to stay. Stay with this thread as it follows now beneath the roots of things, where stories grow slow and deep. The moss beneath the old yew trees grew thicker each year. There was no path to them, not anymore. The villagers had stopped, marking trails long ago, not out of neglect, but respect. The forest around the hollow place had grown wild with listening. It did not bristle or warn, it simply held. And in that hush, things had begun to change. The birds no longer sang in dawn choruses. Instead, they called once, slowly, then waited for wind. Insects moved in spirals, clustering in shapes only the oldest watchers could recognize. And beneath the yew trees, where the roots formed a knotwork of shadows and soil, people had begun to bury threads. Real ones, spun from flax or nettle or wool, but also other threads, unseen ones, hopes, sighs, questions too round to be asked out loud. It began with a woman named Leora, who had once lived on the westernmost edge of the village. She had never held the bowl, never walked to the standing stones, never spoken the rune aloud. But she had listened all her life. And when she knew her time was near, not from illness, but from the soft certainty that sometimes settles into the body like snowfall, she asked only this: bury my name under the roots. Not her body, just her name. She wrote it on a strip of bark, wrapped it in soft linen, and passed it to her grandson. He walked alone into the grove of yew trees. He buried it without word or ritual. And when he returned, he said simply, "I think the trees knew her already." After that, the practice continued. Some brought names, some brought lullabies, some brought the last lines of stories never finished, all wrapped, all buried beneath root and earth, not as loss, but as weaving. Have you ever placed something into the ground not to be forgotten, but to be remembered differently, remembered as soil, as seed, as silence? The edge walker, who had not been seen in many seasons, was said to have walked there last. One child claimed to have followed him, not closely, but from a distance. She said he stood for hours with one hand pressed to a tree. And when he left, there was no footprint, only a spiral of moss that grew faster than the rest. His name, too, was buried, though no one spoke it aloud. It joined the others, beneath the trees, in that network of silence where threads once carved into stone now rested like roots. And the rune? The rune was still there. But now it lived in gestures. A hand placed on bark, a stone left facing west, a pause before entering someone's home. It no longer needed to be shaped. It had become a way of shaping everything else. One boy, whose mother sang to river rocks each morning, asked once, "Was it ever dangerous?" And the old woman tending the garden replied, only if you needed it to mean one thing. He did not ask again, because the truth was, meaning had grown softer over the years, not diluted, but widened, like a lake that no longer holds just one reflection, but many, all shifting with the light. People came less for guidance now, more to simply be in the presence of others. They cooked without recipes, sang without structure, danced with no music but the beat of their feet. In each season, the listening field changed its shape, sometimes oval, sometimes a figure eight, sometimes a spiral that never reached a center. The villagers followed its lines with their own feet, tracing paths into the dew-laced grass in the early morning hours. Not as ritual, not as chore, just to feel the rhythm. One evening, as the sky turned to ash and rose, a small girl brought a bundle of twine and herbs to the center of the field. She didn't speak. She only set it down. And when asked why, she said it was what the field wanted. And none questioned her, because by now, they knew. The field had begun to speak, not in words, not in voices, but in curves and rests, in changes of wind, in how the fire crackled differently after rain. It had become the loom, not to make fabric, but to hold forgetting and remembering side by side. One day, the bowl returned. No one knew how. It was simply there again, in the field's new center, which had shifted slightly eastward, as if following the shadow of a moon never seen. The bowl looked older now, weathered, its rim chipped, but inside it rested a single strand of silver hair, and a spiral of thread, barely visible, barely real. Someone had tied it with a knot at both ends, a shape they all remembered, even if none had tied it in years. They left it untouched, and the bowl remained for many years after that, until one spring, the roots beneath the yew trees began to shift, not collapse, not crack, just breathe. You could feel it if you lay with your ear to the earth, a rhythm, slow as birth, deep as sorrow, familiar as breath. The threads were stirring, not to rise, but to settle deeper. And the people understood. The rune, the one that once should never be carved, had finished being remembered, not forgotten, not erased, but absorbed. They no longer traced it in dirt. They no longer whispered its syllables, but they lived it, in how they waited, in how they touched, in how they left space for things they didn't yet understand. And the bowl, one day, it simply cracked, split in half with no sound, no violence, no wind. It lay there, under the morning sun, its two halves slightly parted, revealing nothing inside. But when a child leaned close, she said, "It smells like remembering." And the field bloomed with tiny white flowers no one had ever seen before. Each one shaped like a spiral, each one soft as a thread pulled loose from a long forgotten sleeve. Tonight, dear listener, the air folds in around you like a soft blanket left out in moonlight, cool at first touch, but warming with memory. It carries no words, only breath. And breath is all you need now to return once again, not to a place, but to a rhythm. We drift onward, gently, into the hush that follows when the last flower opens. The white flowers had no name. No one gave them one. No one dared. They had grown overnight in the hollow place where the bowl had cracked, not scattered or wild, but in a slow spiral, each bloom spaced with the care of a long-held breath. They were small, no larger than a thumbnail, and almost translucent. When sunlight touched them, they shimmered faintly, not with brightness, but with depth, as though each petal held its own quiet sky. People gathered not to marvel, but to sit. No one plucked them, No one wove them into garlands. They simply waited near them, feet bare, eyes lowered, hands resting quietly in their laps. And the flowers responded, not with change, but with presence. The spiral they formed grew outward each day, no faster than a shadow moving across a floor. And with it came a subtle shift in the village, not in buildings, not in paths, but in breath. People began to speak more slowly, to greet each other with touches instead of questions, to pause before naming things. They no longer said, "I understand." They said, "I've heard the silence around that." And when they didn't know what to say at all, they said nothing, and no one filled the gap. It was in that pause that the rune now lived, unshaped, but everywhere. Have you ever seen a flower and known, without knowing why, that it had bloomed for something you forgot to mourn? One morning, as frost clung stubbornly to the garden edges, Runa, now no longer a child, but not yet grown, stood in the center of the spiral. She had walked into it without shoes, without plan. The dew wet her hem. Her hands were empty. She knelt, not to pray, not to gather, but to listen. The flowers did not move. The wind did not stir. But the air around her felt thick with memory. And after a while, Runa placed her palm flat on the ground and whispered a single word. Not in the old tongue, not in any tongue. It came from the space between thought and sound. And when she spoke it, she did not need to understand it. The earth pulsed once beneath her hand, and the flowers around her opened wider. That night, she dreamed of a loom made not of wood or bone, but of roots and stars. Each thread connecting not people, but silences. The next day, she began to speak with her hands, not because she could not use her voice, but because the threads of her thoughts no longer needed sound to be shared. Others followed. Children played by signing lullabies in the air. Elders hummed while weaving invisible braids between fingers and breath. A new kind of language began to take shape, not made of grammar or sequence, but of stillness and shape, of gesture, of resonance. They called it the second weaving. Not everyone used it, but all understood it. There was no need for uniformity, no need for agreement. The spiral of flowers had taught them that things can bloom beautifully even when no one tends them, even when no one plans the pattern. One day, the flowers began to fade, not die. They folded inward, slowly, their petals curling back into the soil. No one tried to preserve them. They simply watched. And when the last one disappeared beneath the moss, a single ring remained in the earth, not pressed or drawn, just slightly greener than the rest. It had no beginning, no end, just the memory of blooming. A child asked if they would come back, and Runa, now the quiet center of the spiral, replied, "Only if we forget again." She did not say it as a warning. She said it with hope, because forgetting, they had come to understand, was not a flaw. It was a threshold, a place where threads fray not from weakness, but from being carried too long. And when they fray, when we forget, the silence calls again, not to erase, but to unbind, to begin anew. The field changed shape once more. Now it moved with the seasons. Its spiral curved wider in spring, narrowed in winter. In rain, it shimmered. In wind, it breathed. And in the hush of dusk, it glowed faintly, not with light, but with memory. The villagers stopped marking time with moons. They marked it with blooms and with returns. Each year, a few would leave, walk west, not to seek, not to escape, but to carry the silence into new soil. Some came back, most didn't. But when the wind blew a certain way, or when a child traced a new pattern in dust that matched the breath of the rune, people knew. The thread was still weaving. One evening, an elder brought a story to Runa. He was bent with time, his voice gravel-soft. He had no offering, only a name. Halvar, he said. Was he real? Runa touched the ground, and the grass bent slightly beneath her fingers. Yes, she said. The elder nodded. Did he know what he started? Runa smiled. He only knew how to listen. And in that answer, the elder wept, not for grief, not for guilt, but because something inside him had finally let go. That night, he left no trace. Only a line of small stones on the edge of the spiral, each one warm to the touch, even in the cold. And it was said that, at the center of the hollow place, you could now hear breathing, not from below, not from above, but from within. Like the earth itself had remembered how to rest, the rune, the one they never drew, lived fully now in the soil. Not as a warning, not as a power, but as a presence. In the way roots curved instead of breaking. In the way fog held the village like a shawl, not a veil. In the way no one needed to say, "You are safe," because the air itself said it, over and over, without voice, without end. Tonight's welcome moves like wind through reeds, never still, never direct, but always circling gently around what matters most. It touches your face, lifts a memory, and slips away before you can follow. That is the kind of story we return to now. One that does not hold you tightly, but walks beside you, barefoot, quiet, and full of remembering. The hollow place no longer needed a name. It had become more than a field, more than a grove, more than a space between. People still visited, yeah, not to seek peace, but to join it. The spiral that once bloomed with nameless white flowers now lived as a path beneath the grass. You could not see it unless the dew gathered just right, unless you stepped lightly enough to feel its shape beneath your feet. Some called it the spiral of listening. Others called it the threaded wind. But most called it nothing at all. It had no center, no marked beginning, only a way of moving. Runa, now older than her years should have made her, remained its quiet guide. She did not speak often, and when she did, her words curved like birds in dusk light, never hurried, never trapped. People said that listening to her was like watching the tide. You didn't remember every wave, but you remembered the sea. She had no home. She slept in many places, sometimes beside the spiral, sometimes in the upper loft of the weaving house, sometimes beneath the old ash tree near the stream. Wherever she laid her head, the wind always came to meet her. She was not worshipped. She was not followed. She was simply echoed. And the children knew this best. They copied her gait when playing. They mimicked her stillness when sitting by the fire. They whispered stories with no endings because they liked the feeling of being unfinished. And in doing so, they continued the loom. Not with thread, not with stone, but with attention. One child, a boy named Ivan, once asked her, "Is the rune still here, even if no one says it?" Runa smiled and placed his hand on his own chest. "It's still here," she said, "because no one has to say it anymore." He didn't ask what that meant, but years later, he would walk alone into the western woods and leave a spiral of feathers on the ridge, without telling anyone why, because by then, he understood. There were no lessons anymore, only inheritance. And even that came softly. Have you ever inherited something you couldn't hold, couldn't name, and yet knew exactly how to carry? There was a woman named Elna. once a traveler, now a quiet gardener in the village. She had arrived barefoot, eyes weary from long watching, shoulders bent under a pack she never opened. She said only, "I think I was meant to forget something here." And they let her. She tended soil in silence, slept with her hands folded like woven cloth, carried water from the stream without spilling a drop. She never touched the spiral, never sat by the bowl, but she hummed. A low, slow tune, no melody, no rhythm, and yet the plants near her home grew in spirals, not arranged, not planted, just grown that way. When asked how, she shrugged and said, "I don't tell them where to go." Runa sat with her often, and they spoke very little. It was said that Elna knew the other side of the rune, the one beyond forgetting, where breath became breeze. And on the day Elna no longer woke, there was no morning, only a gathering of wind, a soft gale that blew through the spiral path and then vanished, leaving behind a scent none could name, like moss, smoke, skin, and distance. Afterward, the trees around her home leaned slightly west, and the birds nested closer to the ground. Not long after, something changed in the spiral. It was not visible. It was not marked. But everyone who walked it felt it. The wind was now moving inward. Before, the spiral had always led outward, a pattern of unfolding, of blooming, of exhale. Now, it circled back toward its unseen center. The path had reversed, not with urgency, not with meaning, only with timing. The rune, the one never carved, had turned. Runa did not speak of it, but she began walking differently, slower, deeper, more often alone. And one dusk, beneath the crimson hush of a closing day, she spoke to the spiral as if it were a friend. "I think it's time to close the circle." No one else heard her, but the air did. And the next morning, the dew did not gather. The grass stayed dry. The wind stilled, and the hush was louder than any song. That evening, as stars blinked into place like old memories returning, the villagers gathered, not because they were called, because they knew. They formed a wide ring around the spiral. They held no torches. They made no speech. They only breathed as one. And from the edge of the field, Runa stepped inward, barefoot, empty-handed. She walked the spiral slowly, each footfall matching her breath, each breath matching the earth. At its center, where the bowl once sat, where the flowers once bloomed, where the silence had always waited, she knelt, placed her hand on the ground, and whispered, "Let it rest." A wind rose, not sharp, not sudden, but deep. It moved through them like a tide returning, and then it faded. And when Runa stood again, she was gone. No figure, no cloth, no dust, only a spiral of flattened grass, no larger than a cradle. And in its center, a single thread, uncut, unknot, just there, waiting for whoever would next remember how to listen. Tonight, dear one, your welcome is no longer spoken. It arrives in the rhythm of your own breath, steady, present, and soft. There is no gate to pass through. You are already inside the circle. Let your shoulders fall now. Let your thoughts quiet. The story has been walking with you all along, and tonight it comes to rest. After Runa disappeared, the spiral remained, but something in it had changed. Not its shape, not its soundlessness, but its need to be noticed. It no longer asked for reverence. It no longer responded to offerings. The spiral, like the rune, had completed its breath. And so the villagers began to walk it differently, no longer with ceremony, no longer with searching. Now they simply walked it when the wind in their chest felt tangled, when a name caught in their throat, when they could not remember what they had forgotten, but still felt the shape of it like a bruise behind the ribs. And the spiral gave them no answers, only rhythm. Inhale, step, exhale, step. By the time they reached the inward curve, they no longer needed to know. What was lost? What had been? What would come? They only needed the pause, and the pause, always, was enough. It is said that many years later, though time moved differently in that place, a child was born beneath the ash tree, not into a home, not into ceremony, only into quiet hands and the first sunlight of spring. She did not cry. She blinked, turned her head toward the wind, and closed her fingers around her own breath, as if grasping the start of a thread only she could see. They called her Lifa, which meant nothing to those outside the village, and everything to those within. It meant the one who follows not after, but beneath. As she grew, it became clear that she was not here to lead or hold or tend. She was here to listen. But she listened to things others did not know how to hear. She heard the ache in a blade of grass bent the wrong way. She heard the way the earth tightened just before rain. She heard the pause between birdsong and silence, and wept once because it sounded like goodbye. She did not walk the spiral until she was 10. And when she did, she walked it backward, not in rebellion, not in jest, only because the wind that morning was moving inward, and she followed it as naturally as breath follows breath. No one stopped her. And when she reached the center, she did not kneel. She lay down, faced the sky, and fell asleep. When she woke, she said only, "The rune has turned to thread, the thread has turned to wind, and the wind has turned to memory." No one asked what it meant. They simply nodded, because by now they knew. Meaning is not always the point. Sometimes, meaning is the echo a story leaves in your chest long after you've forgotten the words. Years passed, as they always do. The spiral faded again, this time not in grass or path, but in memory. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. The field grew over it with wild herbs and thistle and green things that refused naming. The children still played there, though they no longer whispered of looms or bowls. They told stories of wind that could carry dreams, of women who turned into trees, of threads that sang when no one was listening. And somewhere in those stories, the rune lived on, not as symbol, not as sound, but as rhythm. People still came to the village sometimes, strangers drawn by maps that no longer matched the land. Some stayed for a night, some stayed for a season, none stayed forever, because those who came looking for the rune never found it. They asked for marks, for stones, for sacred words, and were met with quiet, not dismissal, just a silence shaped like an open hand. It was always the ones who arrived tired, or lost, or wordless, who stayed, because they heard it. Not a voice, not a story, only a breath. The breath that moved through the leaves, through the roots, through the spaces between questions. And when they finally left, they carried it with them, not as knowledge, but as stillness. They did not speak of the village when they returned to the world, not because they were told not to, but because no one would have believed them. How could they explain a story with no center? A lesson with no teaching? A rune that did not promise power, or truth, or protection? Only pause? They couldn't. And so they stayed quiet and let the breath do the telling. Leifa grew, but never hurried. She braided wind into branches. taught children to write poems in ash that faded with the sun, sat with the dying, and helped them forget in peace. And when her own time came, as all time does, she walked into the grove without a word. No one followed, but a few listened. They said the air folded that day, like a page turned, like a breath released. And when the wind returned, it carried a single sound, not a word, not a name, not even a sigh, only the faint rustle of something letting go. In the seasons that followed, the field was no longer called anything at all. It was not visited. It was not tended. It simply became part of the land again. And in the years beyond years, when even the village had softened into moss and stone and smoke-colored memory, a traveler once passed that way. He stopped on a rise, looked out over the slope, and frowned. "I feel like I've forgotten something," he said aloud, though no one was near. The wind moved. He placed his hand on his chest, felt a thread, faint but real. He stayed the night beneath an old ash tree, though he didn't know why. And when he left the next morning, he did not follow the road. He followed the pause between birdsong and silence. And so the rune, the one you should never carve, was never carved again. Not because it was lost, not because it was feared, but because it no longer needed to be. It had lived its shape. It had become thread. It had become breath. And then it had become the pause that lives in you now, between this sentence and the next. Tonight, there are no greetings left, only presence. Only this pause, which you and I now share. Like standing in a doorway you forgot you opened, looking back at a room that no longer holds you, and forward into something so quiet, so wide, you can no longer tell where story ends and stillness begins. This is the end, dear one. But it will not say so aloud. Let us simply stay with it a while. In the years after the spiral vanished, the land did not forget. It simply turned inward. What had once been paths now softened into mossy trails that led nowhere. The hearths that once held stories crumbled gently into the soil, their stones resting where hands had once warmed themselves. The trees leaned toward one another, not to speak, but to hold. And in the wind, always the wind, there were no songs. Only rhythm, only that slow pulse of breath, and root and memory returning to itself. No one lived in the village anymore, not in the way people think of living. No, roofs stood, no names hung on doors. But the place had not been abandoned. It had been absorbed. It had completed itself. And far away, in another land, perhaps beyond mountains, perhaps across seas, perhaps only a few footsteps beyond a life you haven't lived yet, a child stood beside a river. She had never heard the name Rune. She had never held the bowl. She had never seen the rune. But one night, in a dream, she'd felt her breath stop, not from fear, from recognition. She had woken before dawn, walked barefoot through the wet grass, and followed the wind until it changed direction without moving. And there, beside the river's bend, she knelt, drew in the sand with one finger. Not a rune, not a circle, only a curve. A breath turned downward. When the water rose hours later and washed it away, she did not weep. She only whispered, "It's ready." You see, the thread had not ended. It had only gone quiet long enough to be woven into something else. It had become the way wind moves through willow branches. It had become the silence between two people who no longer need to speak. It had become the hand placed gently on a chest during sleep. The weightless moment before a name is forgotten with peace. The shape of a dream too soft to hold. And yes, it had become a question. but not one that demanded answering. Only one that lingered, like the last light in a room, waiting for someone to remember they were never alone in it. In time, the stories of the rune would drift, as stories always do. They would change shape, lose names, gain details never there. Some would say it was cursed. Some would say it granted power. Some would say it was never real at all. But somewhere, always, someone would pause before finishing a sentence. Someone would stop and close their eyes, listening to the wind in an empty room. Someone would wake with a mark on their palm they never carved, and someone else would answer a question never asked. And in those moments, the thread would pull gently again, asking nothing, offering everything. The rune, the one you should never carve, was never about silence. It was about how we hold it, how we don't run from it, how we welcome it in, how we carry it with both hands, gently, across a lifetime, and then let it down beside a stone or a tree or a sleeping child and say, here's the thing I could never name, and now I give it to the wind. If you've listened this far, you already know the shape of it. You don't need a word for it. You don't even need to remember the story. Only the breath you've carried with you through it, the way your thoughts slowed, the way your shoulders softened, the way the room, wherever you are now, feels just a little quieter, as if something has just left or just arrived. So I will ask the last question now, as all keepers must,